Welcome back to Panda's Nightmares, where the strange and unsettling come to life. Tonight, we're diving into a collection of stories that will send chills down your spine, the creepy things children say to their elders. Kids are known for their wild imaginations, but sometimes their words carry a darkness that's impossible to ignore. From eerie predictions to encounters with things unseen, these stories will make you think twice about the innocence of childhood. Before we begin, I want to share something important. I'm currently raising funds for my dad's medical treatment, and your support would mean the world to me. If you'd like to help, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for being here, and now, let's dive into the unsettling world of creepy kids. Story 1. My co-worker's 4-year-old daughter always believed that the rattling of the water pipes in the kitchen cupboards was caused by white wolves. The sound terrified her, and she would talk about it often. One day, as she sat at the kitchen table, she suddenly said, "Mum, the white wolves aren't bad. They're our friends." Her mum, wanting to ease her fears, encouraged the thought. "Yes," she said, "the white wolves are protecting us. They are our friends." Her daughter nodded, but then added, almost casually, "They're our friends, but not the man who crawls on the floor and stands by my bed." Story 2. I work in a preschool, and let me tell you, creepy things get said and done all the time. But there's one moment from last year that really stands out. In our classroom, there's a small kitchenette area that the kids use during free time to play house or come up with whatever pretend games they can imagine. There was one little girl I was keeping a close eye on that day. She was usually pretty withdrawn and didn't interact much with the other kids, so I was curious to see what she was up to. I noticed her playing with a baby doll in the kitchenette. She was rocking it back and forth, gently singing to it. It seemed innocent enough until it wasn't. She suddenly stopped singing, picked up the doll, and shoved it into the play oven. She slammed the oven door shut, turned around, and looked straight at me. In the creepiest little voice I've ever heard, she said, "Sometimes bad babies go in timeout." Then she smiled, ran off, and went on playing like nothing had happened. That one definitely shook me. Story 3. When my son was about 3 years old, he used to do this weird crawl where he'd slide his forehead along the floor. That alone was unsettling. Then one night, he crawled across the hallway into my room like that, stood just a few inches from my face, and made a bizarre meowing sound. After that, he climbed into bed with me and went to sleep like nothing happened. Another time, he was freaking out about a monster in the basement. To calm him down, I went down with him, turned on the lights, and showed him there was nothing there. Satisfied, I turned off the light and started heading back upstairs. That's when he said, very matter-of-factly, "He's right behind us now." I'm not ashamed to admit I might have peed a little. The creepiest moment, though, happened one day after I scolded him for misbehaving. He hid his head under a blanket, so I decided to play along and pretended I couldn't find him. I said, "Where is my little Carson?" Slowly, he lowered the blanket, fixed me with the most chilling dead-eyed stare, and said, "Carson is gone. I am Rick. We don't know any Ricks. Never have, as far as I can remember. I have no idea where he picked up that name, but I'm pretty sure he was possessed." Story 4. My 3-year-old nephew was visiting my cottage, and on several occasions, he asked me about the girl over there, always pointing toward one of the back bedrooms. The place is small, and there's absolutely no one else there. So I dismissed it as his very active imagination. He has plenty of imaginary friends. A while later, some friends came to visit, bringing along their daughter, who was about the same age as my nephew. She had never met him before. Twice in the same day, she asked about the pretty girl, pointing at the exact same room. That definitely caught me off guard. I didn't know what to think. Then, at Christmas, my family came to visit my house. My nephew noticed a picture of my wife and pointed at it, asking if she was going to visit us here, or if she just stayed at the cottage. My wife passed away 10 years ago. I don't really believe in paranormal stuff, so my logical brain tells me it's just a coincidence, a combination of kids' ramblings and my own tendency to connect the dots. But it definitely got my attention. Story 5. My father tells me this story from my childhood every now and then. When I was about 6 years old, my dad's best friend, Joe, committed suicide. It was an incredibly rough and emotional time for my dad. Joe had been his best man at his wedding, and the one constant in his life growing up. After my parents got married, they left their hometown and Joe behind, moving around California before eventually settling in Utah, where my dad worked for a successful internet business. Joe, however, stayed in Washington. Because of the distance, my dad had no warning or foresight about Joe's decision to take his life. In the aftermath, Joe's sister blamed Joe's wife for his death. Joe and his wife had a tumultuous relationship. They drank heavily and fought often, but my dad always said they were deeply in love, one of the most passionate couples he'd ever known. For that reason, he didn't believe the blame was justified. A few days after Joe's death, his widow called my father, sobbing uncontrollably. She told him she felt it was her fault. My dad spent about an hour consoling her, saying, "If there was a way for me to talk to Joe right now, I guarantee you he would tell you that he loved you, and that it wasn't your fault." She thanked him but didn't seem comforted. After the long, emotional phone call, my dad was drained. He went upstairs to check on us kids and make a pot of coffee, hoping for a moment of peace. He peeked into each of our rooms. My sister was sleeping soundly, as was my brother. When he got to my room, I was also fast asleep, so he headed toward the kitchen. As he passed my room again, he heard a soft whimper. Turning back, he entered and found me sitting on the edge of my bed, quietly crying. The way I was crying struck him as strange. Normally, a 5-year-old would cry loudly or dramatically. Instead, I was sitting there, silently weeping. Concerned, my dad knelt down and asked, "Matty, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" I stopped crying for a moment, looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, and said, "Rick, it's not her fault. I love her. It's not her fault." Then, without another word, I lay back down, rolled over, and fell asleep, as if nothing had happened. Needless to say, my dad was shaken to his core. He never forgot that moment, and he still tells the story to this day. Story 6. One morning, my wife was getting our 2-year-old son up for the day. He was standing in his crib when she walked in and greeted him with a cheerful, "Good morning." As she got closer, he lifted up her shirt slightly and tilted his head to the side, as if he were inspecting something. Curious, she asked him, "What are you doing?" Without hesitation, he replied, "Looking for my baby sister in your tummy." She laughed it off as one of those quirky, imaginative things kids say. At the time, we hadn't talked about where babies come from, nor had we mentioned the idea of having another child around him. It was completely out of the blue. A few weeks later, we found out she was 2 weeks pregnant at the time of his comment, and it was, in fact, a girl. We're due in September. To this day, it gives us chills thinking about it. We still can't explain how he knew. Story 7. A good friend of mine and her husband bought what's considered an old house for the area Western Canada, where houses over 100 years old are pretty rare. One day, while I was visiting, they were renovating the basement. I was down there alone with their son, who was just shy of 2 years old and couldn't yet speak in full sentences. While we were down there, he suddenly took my hand and led me over to a brick, chimney-like structure with a rusty metal door on it. He looked up at me and said, "Clear as day, that's where the dead babies go." I was horrified. First of all, this was a kid who could barely string a full sentence together, let alone say something so unsettling. Secondly, I doubt he even understood what the word dead meant. I'm absolutely certain no one would have told him something like that, and there were no older kids around who could have said it as a joke. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it. I can't explain it, and it remains one of the creepiest moments I've ever experienced. Story 8. About 4 or 5 months ago, around 3 a.m., I was abruptly awoken by a strange, guttural growling sound. Disoriented and still in the dark, I couldn't figure out what it was. I had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, which only added to my confusion. My first thought was that maybe the cat had caught something, but I really had no clue. As my vision started to adjust, I noticed a grotesque, 3-foot shadowy figure standing just a few feet in front of me, growling. It was creepy as hell. For a moment, I just sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Even though it only took a few seconds to figure it out, I must have looked like someone genuinely terrified. It was my son. My 3-year-old had snuck out of bed at 3 in the morning, somehow found his Hulk mask in the dark, and decided to come find me to play superheroes. Apparently, his idea of playing was to crouch 2 feet away from my sleeping face and let out a terrifying Hulk growl until I woke up in a panic. A few weeks later, he pulled the exact same stunt on my wife, which I found way more hilarious. She didn't think it was quite as funny. Story 9. When my son was in kindergarten, I received a call from his teacher while I was at work. She said he refused to go outside during recess and was sitting there, terrified. He told her there was a man named Oti, with brown hair and a brown beard, who kept saying, "Come here, buddy," over and over while he was playing outside before school started. They reviewed the security tapes and didn't see anyone. It scared me, thinking someone might have been trying to abduct him, but I wasn't sure if he was imagining things or seeing something else. He also mentioned Oti talking to him at the bus stop or even outside his window, which was on the 2nd floor. When he was 1 or 2 years old, he refused to go near half of one of our old houses. He'd just stand in the doorway and point. Story 10. When I was about 4 or 5, I decided to dress up as Batman using whatever I could find in our pantry. My outfit consisted of my mum's leather jacket, which dragged on the floor behind me, a pair of black boots, and a ski mask with an open face that drooped down over my eyes. I thought I looked pretty cool. Excited to show off my costume, I went into my mum's room to wake her up. At that age, I thought the way to wake someone up was to open their eyes for them after all. Awake people have their eyes open, right? So, I tried to open my mum's eyes by gently pushing her eyelids back. She woke up in a dimly lit room to the sight of a 3-foot-tall figure, dressed entirely in black, with no visible legs and a ski mask poking at her eyes. Naturally, she screamed and jumped back in horror. Once she realized it was me, we both burst out laughing. I'd completely forgotten about this story until now, but I'm sure my mum never has. Story 11. This story isn't about children, but very old people who can sometimes be just as childlike in their acceptance of the strange and unexplainable. I used to work in a nursing home for nuns, and I often noticed that, in the days leading up to their passing, they would sometimes do strange things. One night, I was working the midnight shift, and it was around 3 a.m. I was in a dark hallway, quietly cleaning wheelchairs, when Senior Frances came out of her room and wandered toward me. She took my hand and said, "Listen, do you hear that beautiful music?" I was both creeped out and intrigued, so I let her guide me. She led me down the hallway to a window, opened it, and said again, "Listen, oh my, it's so beautiful. That music." I didn't hear anything, but I nodded and agreed with her, not wanting to upset her. After a moment, I gently guided her back to her room and tucked her in. A few days later, Senior Frances passed away. Before she became a nun, she had played piano in theaters for silent movies, and music had always been a huge part of her life. Even now, I wonder if she truly heard something that night, something only she could hear. Story 12. My kid's Catholic school is over 100 years old. There's a basement under the gym that's used for storage. One day, I was subbing during recess when a kickball bounced down the stairs to the basement. I noticed a little girl standing at the top of the stairs, yelling, "Just throw it up to me." Curious, I went over and asked who she was talking to. She casually replied, "That big man down the stairs." I went down to check, but there was nobody there, and the basement has only one way in or out. Later, I asked some of the other kids if they had seen the man before. They said, yes, but Sister told us not to talk to him. When I asked them to describe Sister, they described a nun. The strange thing is, there haven't been nuns at the school in over 40 years. Story 13. When I was a kid, Mr. Rand used to come into my room 4 or 5 times a week. He would talk to me, tell me stories, and even share how he was killed in World War II. To me, Mr. Rand was just a figment of my 4-year-old imagination. Then, when I was about 9 years old, Mr. Rand stopped showing up altogether, and I eventually forgot about him. Fast forward to about 3 years ago. My son, who was about 5 at the time, came out of his room one night around 11:30 and said there was a man in his room. I freaked out, ran in to check, and found nothing. That's when my son calmly said, "Mr. Rand said you can't see him anymore, but he's okay." Apparently, my son also has his own Mr. Rand, but they only chat once or twice a year. Story 14. A friend of mine was 6 years old when she told her mum, "The lady who used to live here told me she hates the wallpaper, and you're covering her note." Her mum brushed it off as make-believe rambling and forgot about it. 12 years later, her mum decided to redecorate the attic. While stripping the old wallpaper, she discovered a suicide note scratched into the wall beneath it. Completely freaked out, she called my friend in tears, asking if she remembered anything more about the woman who had spoken to her. That's when my friend started to recall the woman and began freaking out herself. She said she only remembered talking to the woman in the attic. Story 15. We had visited my grandparents earlier that day, and everything had been fine. But when it was time to go to bed, my brother, who was about 5 years old at the time, started crying and saying he needed to talk to Papa because he's sick. My mum and dad reassured him over and over that everything was fine. After all, we had just seen my grandparents earlier, and nothing seemed wrong. But my brother wouldn't stop screaming and insisting. Finally, to calm him down, my mum called my grandparents. My grandma answered and said my grandpa was asleep, but she decided to take the phone into his room so he could talk to my grandpa. When she went into the room, she found him unresponsive. He had just suffered a heart attack. Thankfully, because my brother somehow knew something was wrong, my grandma was able to get help in time, and my grandpa survived. That was 23 years ago. My grandpa just passed away 2 years ago at the age of 92. Story 16. My mum's dad passed away 10 years before I was born. When I was about 6 or 7, my parents divorced. The day before my mum told me about the divorce, I was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing while she was cooking tea. She says I suddenly stopped what I was doing and looked toward the front door, as if I'd heard it open. I stared at the door for a long time, then giggled, turned to her, and said, "Granddad says don't worry, everything will be okay, and he won't let anything bad happen." After that, I started humming and went back to my drawing like nothing had happened. My mum says it's the single creepiest thing that's ever happened to her. I have absolutely no memory of it. Story 17. Between the ages of 2 and 6, my son would repeatedly tell me the same story about how he picked me to be his mother. He described being with a man in a suit and choosing a mother who would help him accomplish his soul's mission. I'm an atheist, so spirituality wasn't something we discussed. Nor was he raised in any sort of religious environment at that point. He explained it like grocery shopping. He said he was in a bright room with people lined up like dolls, and he picked me. The man in the suit asked him if he was sure, and he replied that he was, and then he was born. My son also had an early fascination with World War II roadplanes. He could identify them, explain their parts, and even know where they were used, all in astonishing detail. I still have no idea where he got that knowledge. I'm a science person, and his dad is a math guy. We've never been into history, let alone World War II. We've always called him Grandpa, because of his peaceful, gingerly demeanor. This kid seriously has an old soul. Story 18. I don't know if this is relevant, but here's something I said when I was a kid. When I was about 5, my dad's cousin had a tragic breakdown. He shot his 7-year-old son, and then himself, after his wife filed for divorce and requested custody of their son. It was an incredibly dark time for the family. After it happened, my dad and his brothers were tasked with cleaning out the cousin's house. Since I was the youngest kid in the family at the time, they decided I should inherit some of the little boy's toys. One of the things I got was a little Tykes outdoor play castle. You know, the one it looked like a little plastic castle tower where you could sit inside. It was such a cool fort. One day, I was sitting inside the tower part, and my mum was on the deck nearby. She heard me talking to myself and came over to ask who I was talking to this time. I had a lot of imaginary friends back then. I told her I was talking to the little boy whose castle it used to be. I said I was telling him not to cry because my mummy could be his mummy now. My mum promptly had my dad throw the castle out. Story 19. A few months ago, my 3-year-old daughter had the flu. After she started feeling a little better, my wife took her outside to play in the backyard. While sitting on the back step, my daughter ran up to my wife and asked, "Can I play with the little girl on the slide?" Confused, my wife said, "I don't see a little girl." My daughter insisted, "She's right over there on the slide. Mom, can't I play with her?" My wife, trying to stay calm, replied, "I don't see anyone." My daughter, undeterred, said, "She's on the slide, and she's blue. Can I play with her?" Now thoroughly unsettled, my wife told her, "Let's go inside and make a snack." They went inside, but for the rest of the day, my daughter kept looking out the back door. Each time, she told my wife, "The little blue girl is lonely." Story 20. I'm not a parent myself, but a friend of mine has a 4-year-old son who lives with his mother. They're separated. When the boy was nearly 4, one of his mother's housemates had a litter of puppies and was in the process of finding homes for them. One day, the boy put one of the puppies into the front loader washing machine along with some laundry and managed to set it on a spin cycle. Then he went back into his room across from the laundry to play. My friend, the boy's dad, was visiting at the time and heard the washing machine running. He went to check on it and discovered the horrifying sight of the puppy inside. Thinking his son didn't understand what he had done, he quickly removed the dead puppy to spare the boy from being traumatized. As he walked past his son's room with the puppy, the boy looked up, checked the washing machine, and asked, "Where is that dead puppy, Daddy?" It was, without a doubt, one of the creepiest things I've ever heard a kid say or do. Apart from that one incident, though, the boy has always been completely normal. Story 21. I have a 3-year-old who says some pretty strange things. Last night, he said, "Mummy, the man, the very big man with big yellow eyes, is looking at you." I looked around but saw nothing. I told him there was no man and that he was make-believe. My son just laughed and said, "Oh, he's hiding now." 2 minutes later, he added, "Oh no, Mummy, you made him very mad. Now he says he will come when you are sleeping. A few weeks ago, he told me, 'I'm not going to be 4. I'm going to die. And you will put me down, down, down in the hole.'" I tried to reassure him and asked who told him that. He got quiet, then said, "The man told me. But I will be scared. So after 3 nights, you die too, and come with me." Sheesh, as if I didn't already have enough bad dreams. Story 22. Not creepy, but you be the judge. This happened a few years ago, when my daughter was around 5 years old. She was in the bathtub, happily playing with her toys, including her favorite motorized swimming toy fish. Meanwhile, my wife and I were in bed, relaxing, probably watching some Maury or something. Suddenly, I hear, "Daddy, Daddy." I walk into the bathroom. "Yes, sweetheart. I've got something to tell you," she says with a big smile. Puzzled, I reply, "Okay, what is it?" Still smiling, she says, "Daddy, when I put the fish right here, it tickles." Cue my mortified expression as I immediately yell, "Honey." Story 23. My younger brother had an imaginary friend when he was little. He was also an avid sleepwalker, which made things even creepier. When he was about 3 or 4, he started talking about someone he called Freya. He described Freya as a dark-skinned man wearing little clothing who loved to hunt in the wilderness. One day, he told me that Freya used to live nearby a long time ago. Then he casually added that some white people came, burned him alive, and killed his village. Not exactly something you expect to hear from a 4-year-old. I'd hear him having conversations, like he was talking to someone, but every time I peeked into his room to check, he would immediately stop talking, turn his head, and stare at me. It was unsettling, to say the least. That summer, my other brother, the middle child, was visiting his dad. And the day before he returned, my youngest brother said, "Freya doesn't like when brother is mean to me. He's going to scare him." The night my middle brother came home, my mum and I were downstairs when we heard a scream that still haunts me to this day. We ran upstairs and found him swearing that someone had been violently shaking his bed. It was bunk bed, and my youngest brother was sound asleep on the bottom bunk. A month later, my youngest brother had a bad fall and cracked his skull. Thankfully, he recovered, but he never mentioned Freya again after that. However, his sleepwalking continued. Sometimes, I'd wake up to find him standing silently next to my bed, staring at me until I woke up and promptly freaked out. One night, at around 4 a.m., I heard the front door open and close. Alarmed, I went to check and found my brother standing at the far end of the yard, in the snow, wearing nothing but his underwear. He was staring straight at me, ... Then, slowly, he raised his hand and waved. The chills that ran down my spine weren't from the cold. Story 24. My boss had 2 daughters, one of whom passed away at a very young age due to a medical condition. She died in her early 20s. As part of their grieving process, the family found it easier not to keep pictures of her up or talk about her much. The other sister went on to have 5 children, and one of her daughters, at a very young age, frequently talked about playing with her imaginary friend, Lisa. At first, no one thought much of it. That is, until one day when the little girl casually mentioned that her friend Lisa was actually her aunt and that she visited her quite often. What made this particularly unsettling is that the little girl had never been told about her aunt. She hadn't been exposed to the fact that she even had an aunt, let alone that she had passed away long before she was born. No one had ever mentioned her name in the girl's presence. When I heard this story, being close to the family, it completely freaked me out. Story 25. We recently moved into a new house. My daughter's room has a closet at the end of a narrow little hallway. One morning, about a week after moving in, I woke up and noticed my daughter wasn't in her bed. No big deal, I figured she was downstairs. But when I went to check, she wasn't there either. I looked everywhere for her, nothing. Finally, I went back to her room and called out, "Are you in here?" From the closet, I heard her yell, "Don't come in here." I walked down the little hallway leading to the closet, but couldn't see her since she was inside and to the left. "Don't come in here," she shouted again. "Please come out," I said. "Don't look at me. "What are you doing in there, Caitlin?" I asked. "I'm not Caitlin." I noped right out of there. Freaked out, I went and got my wife out of bed. She came in to check on our daughter. It turns out, Caitlin was in the closet, putting on a strawberry shortcake costume to surprise me. She didn't want me to see her until she had it on. It freaked me right the fuck out though. Story 26. I'm not sure if this counts as creepy, but it was definitely something. When my son was 2, he started asking me, "You fucking with me?" He said it with a perfect De Niro impression, which threw me off even more. I'd freak out and tell him not to say that, but I couldn't figure out where he'd picked it up. Fast forward to Thanksgiving dinner. My entire family, my wife's entire family, everyone was there. Just as dinner started, my son turned to my wife's grandma and asked, "You fucking with me?" Holy shit, the whole room fell apart. Everyone started raising their voices, scolding my poor little 2-year-old, who had no clue what he'd done wrong. Naturally, everyone assumed he'd learned it from me. Awesome. A few weeks later, he finally managed to pronounce it correctly. Play football with me. He's 6 now, and I can't wait until he's old enough to hear this story. Story 27. About a year ago, my daughter, who was about 3 years old at the time, woke up screaming around 2 a.m. The sound of her voice told me something wasn't right. Still groggy and half asleep, I rushed down the hall to her room without turning any lights on, hoping not to wake her brother. When I got to her bed, I could hear her screaming right in front of me. But when I pulled back the covers, she wasn't there. At that moment, my half-awake brain struggled to process what was happening. I could hear her as if she was right in front of me, but she was nowhere to be seen. I turned on the light, but she still wasn't in her bed. Meanwhile, she was getting more and more panicked because she could hear me, could tell I was searching for her, and realized I couldn't find her either. After what felt like an eternity but was probably just seconds, I finally figured out what had happened. She had fallen out of bed, rolled underneath it, and got stuck. She freaked out because she couldn't move and didn't know where she was. I'll never forget that moment of sheer panic when I pulled back the covers, heard her screaming, but saw an empty bed. It's a feeling that still gives me chills. Story 28. This isn't directly related to me, but it's something that stuck with me. I used to frequent this family-run comic book shop, and the owner, who I was close friends with, had a few kids. His oldest was about 5 or 6 at the time. A group of us helped move the shop to a new location in the historical part of the city. While we were moving stuff into the finished basement, we came across a door that led to an old, unfinished tunnel. It stretched on for what seemed like forever. It was dark, creepy, and lit by a single dangling light bulb. The owner's son walked up, looked at the door, and said, "That's where the ghosts live." His dad laughed and said, "There's no ghosts in there." Without missing a beat, the kid gave his father a cold, serious look and said, "They're in there. You just can't see them." My friend and I exchanged a nervous chuckle, but the way that kid said it, let's just say, we didn't go near that tunnel again unless we absolutely had to. Story 29. My son is autistic. He's not nonverbal, but he struggles with back-and-forth conversations. When we moved into a new place, I started noticing a lot of strange things, especially in his room. One evening, I was cooking dinner and realized he was unusually quiet. It was twilight, so I went to check on him. When I walked into his room, I found him crouched by the window, trembling like he couldn't move. Concerned, I asked, "What's wrong, baby?" He whispered, "I'm scared." "Why are you scared?" I asked. He replied, "He comes in through the cold, dark window." Then he turned to look at me as I glanced out the window and said, "No, Mama, he's mean." It was only the 3rd time he'd ever called me Mama, which made the moment even more unsettling. A month later, my husband, who was convinced it was nothing, decided to put our son to bed in his room. My son had been sleeping with me since the incident. While this was happening, I was outside talking to a friend. When I came back inside, I saw the flash of my husband's phone as he turned pale. I asked what happened, and he showed me the photo he'd just taken. There was a creepy man standing over our son, leering directly at my husband through the camera. Stunned, I asked, "Why did you take the picture?" He replied, "I felt like someone was watching me." Story 30. Okay, rule breaker McGee here, but I figured I'd share the creepiest thing I ever did or said to my parents. Now, I don't have any memory of this, and the only reason I believe it is the sincerity with which my parents have told me and retold it to others over the years. It's been a while since we talked about it, so forgive the lack of exact details. When I was about 3 or 4, I started talking about my other family. My older sibling had imaginary friends around the same age, so at first, my parents assumed it was just the same kind of thing. At the time, I talked mostly about a little girl. It carried on for a few weeks, and no one thought much of it until I started mentioning a man and a woman, my other mummy and daddy. That's when my mum realized something unusual. I never talked about these people in the present tense, the way a child with imaginary friends usually would. Everything I said about them was in the past tense, describing things we had done. That, combined with the introduction of the other mummy and daddy, made my parents take a closer look at what I was saying. Eventually, my mum asked, "Who were you talking about?" I looked at her with what she described as an unsettling seriousness for a child, and said, "My other family." I had plenty of stories about my other family. One that stood out to my dad happened the first time he took me to the beach. He asked if I was excited to see the ocean, and I told him, completely unimpressed, "I've already been here." With my other family, what should have been a fun day out turned into something eerie, as my mood and behavior completely changed, becoming more serious and distant whenever I mentioned my other family. After several more unsettling comments, my parents decided to sit me down and ask me directly what I was talking about. Up to that point, I would apparently clam up whenever they tried to ask too many questions. This time, I answered. They asked me if I could see my other mummy, daddy, or sister. I said no. They asked if they'd ever been to our house. I said no. When they asked where I saw them, I whispered, "Before." Then I hopped off the chair and went back to playing with my Legos. Still watching me, my dad asked one more question. Where did they go? Without turning around, I answered, "Down. Down into the hole in the ground." I even made hand motions to emphasize it. At this point, my parents were sitting there, stunned, as their 4-year-old calmly talked about the burial of his other family. My dad pressed further, asking, "Where did they go into a hole?" I turned around and said, "Granddad's house." That was enough for my dad to grab the car keys. We piled into the car, my mom, dad, and grandfather, and set out for answers. When we got there, it turned out I wasn't talking about my granddad's house, but a graveyard about 10 minutes away. My parents swore they'd never taken me there, and my granddad insisted he hadn't either. It wasn't the kind of place a 4-year-old would just stumble upon. Still, I confidently led them through the graveyard, weaving past rows of markers until I stopped about 3/4 of the way back. Without hesitation, I pointed to an old, weather-beaten limestone gravestone and said, "In there." After that day, I never mentioned my other family again. My parents avoided bringing it up until I was a teenager, casually asking, "Do you remember doing this?" For context, that graveyard has been in use since the 1200s, with everything from famine victims to WWI vets buried there. Aside from the soldiers, there hadn't been a burial there since the 1800s. Story 31. I take care of my niece full-time, so she's basically like a daughter to me. She's done some weird things over the years, but these are a few of my favorites. When she was a toddler, I woke up to the sensation of my hair being brushed. When I opened my eyes, she looked at me, put a finger to her lips, and said, "She," for trying to manually close my eyelids, like you would for a dead person. Another time, she was sick, and we were lying in bed together, watching a movie. Out of nowhere, she dropped this gem. Don't lay with your feet hanging off the bed like that. The devil can grab you and pull you to hell. She's only 5, so I tell myself she probably picked that up from a kid at school. Right. And last but not least, I was in the kitchen making dinner when she casually walked through and said, "I'll get you, and I'll make it look like a bloody accident." That one scared the shit out of me. Later, I found out it came from the cat in the hat. Story 32. Growing up in our 100-year-old house in a small town, I had a vague memory of seeing someone I called the Animal Man. I don't remember much about what he actually looked like, and I probably would have forgotten about him completely if not for something strange that happened years later. One day, when I was around 20 and living away from home, my mom told me that her friend had brought her young son, Chad, over to the house for a visit. A few days later, my mum mentioned in passing that Chad had said he saw the Animal Man. She didn't seem particularly alarmed and might have forgotten that I used to call him by that name too. Or maybe she thought it was just a strange coincidence. Nothing came of it until I was catching up with a friend and his dad one day. I mentioned how weird my mum's old house was and told them about the Animal Man. That's when my friend's dad shared a story that sent chills down my spine. The house had originally been built by the Ball family, who lived there for many years. But before my family moved in, there was a man who lived there with his beloved shaggy dog. When the dog died, the man had it made into a coat. Not long after, the man took his own life at a nearby beach by shooting himself with a shotgun. My mum, who was of the faith, apparently held a lodge in the house to cleanse it of the spirit after I started seeing the Animal Man. I must have been very young because I don't remember or much about him. My mom never mentioned it to me or my 2 sisters. Hearing about Chad's experience 10+ years later brought all those memories rushing back. The fact that the Animal Man has now been seen by more than one child, seemingly only young boys, still gives me chills to this day. Story 33. I don't have kids of my own yet, but my little brother did something years ago that still creeps me out to this day. He was about 3 years old when it happened. My mum called me from my room to grab her a towel so she could keep an eye on both of my little brothers who were playing in the tub. I grabbed the towel and was walking into the bathroom when my 3-year-old brother, who normally had that adorable broken little kid speech, suddenly sat up straight in the tub. He cocked his head and in the most serious, clear, and pronounced voice said, "Look, Mum, I can't die." Then he crossed his arms over his chest and slid underwater. For a second, my mum and I were frozen, processing what had just happened. Then she pulled him out as quickly as she could. He had inhaled a bunch of water and was crying, but thankfully he was okay. Fast forward a couple of years, we were replacing the trim in my little brother's room, which was adjacent to the bathroom, while tearing down the trim in their closet, which adjoined my parents' room. We found something unexpected: an old penciled height chart on the wall beneath the trim. It only had one name on it: Alan. The height chart stopped at the age of 5. The elderly woman who had sold us the house had mentioned that she and her husband were the original owners and had never had kids. But something didn't add up. Curious, we did some digging. Thanks to the public library's newspaper archives, we found an article from the 1950s that told the full story. It turned out the couple did have a child. His name was Alan, and he had drowned in the tub in the same bathroom where my brother had his episode. According to the article, Alan had been left unsupervised, stood up in the tub, slipped, hit his head, and drowned. After learning that, I refused to even go into my parents' bathroom again. Story 34. Every now and then, I would snap as a kid and do something unusual. One day, I hung all my Barbies naked from the swing set in our backyard. After that, I never played with them again. Occasionally, my brothers and I would make grass dolls and burn them as sacrifices. Otherwise, I was a complete angel always, the goody two-shoes of the family. When I was about 2, I had an imaginary friend. This friend would tell me to do bad things, like break plates or scream randomly. Suddenly, I had this vocabulary that my parents couldn't figure out. Ty didn't go to daycare, and we didn't have a TV. Overnight, I became a completely different kid. I wouldn't eat, which was especially odd, because I was a chubby child who never turned away food. Then one day, my aunt came to visit. As soon as she walked into the house, she paused and said, "What is that?" She claimed she could feel the presence of my imaginary friend. Freaked out, my family prayed over me and had the house blessed. For weeks afterward, I would complain that my friend was begging to come back inside. I'd scream things like, "She's banging, she wants to come in," or "She's crying by the door, Mum." My mum says this went on for a while before it finally stopped. I don't remember any of it. According to my mum, aside from that phase, I was a good kid. Oh, and I once knew a girl who would randomly tell people, "Jesus is watching you." Story 35. I'm not a parent, and this isn't something I said that creeped my parents out, but it's still a story that gives me chills whenever I think about it. When I was about 5 or 6, I had trouble sleeping one night. I had this strange, overwhelming feeling that something was very wrong. Standing on my bed, I looked out the window into our back garden and saw a man standing behind a bush. Terrified, I screamed for my parents. My mum came upstairs from the living room, where she had been watching TV with my dad. I told her there was a man in the garden, but she assured me it was just a bad dream. She looked outside but didn't see anyone. I tried to go back to sleep, but couldn't shake the feeling. I looked out again, and the man was still there. I ran downstairs, begging my parents to believe me. I told them I wouldn't go back to my room until I knew there was no man. My dad reluctantly decided to check the garden to put my fears to rest. Just as he was about to open the back door, there was a knock at the front door. It was a policeman. He said they had received a call from our house about a man in the garden. This was before mobile phones, so the call had to have come from our landline. The officer came in, went into the garden, and found the man hiding behind the bush exactly where I said he was. To this day, we still have no idea who made the phone call. The police insisted it came from our house, but none of us had used the phone that night. And that's it for tonight's collection of the unnerving and unexplainable things kids say. If you enjoyed these stories, or if they left you looking over your shoulder, don't forget to subscribe to Panda's Nightmares for more chilling tales. Hit that like button, follow for updates, and be sure to check out my other videos for more mysterious and spine-tingling content. And one last thing, if you can, please consider supporting my dad's medical treatment through the GoFundMe link in the description. Your kindness and generosity mean everything. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the scariest words come from the littlest voices. Stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.